Thank you. I'll certainly have to acknowledge that Dr. Miller is a very worthy opponent. He covered a great deal of material and did it very well. It's going to be certainly difficult for me to answer it in the 20 minutes. I would say that there are answers, however, and I would commend to you some of the literature and further study if you'd like to carry it a little further. I am sorry that somehow it didn't come through that I was giving positive evidence for creation. We suggested I was only arguing against evolution. What I tried to do, and let me just reiterate, was to show the predictions from the creation model, having defined it, and then to show that the actual facts conform to the predictions. For example, the creation model predicts the two laws of thermodynamics as universal principles, and then that's what we find. The evolution model does not predict those. In fact, it would be very difficult to explain those in the framework of the evolution model, but it certainly doesn't predict them. Creation model does. Creation model predicts the gaps in the fossil record, and that's exactly what we find. Evolution model does not predict the gaps in the fossil record. It maybe can explain them, but it doesn't predict them, and so on. The actual data conform precisely to the expectations of the creation model. Also, if you recall, just at the end, although I didn't have time really to develop it fully, tried to show that the prediction related to catastrophism was fulfilled in the actual facts of the records in the rocks. In other words, the rock systems, the fossil graveyards, the hydraulic characteristics of the rocks, all of these speak of catastrophism throughout the entire record. And furthermore, they conform to the concept of one catastrophe, the entire geological column indicating continuous deposition, catastrophic deposition, and therefore relating necessarily all to one age. The fossil record, instead of representing the slow evolution of life over many, many billions of years, many ages, represents the extinction of life, the destruction of life in one age, because the evidence indicates catastrophic deposition throughout the geological column, furthermore continuous deposition throughout the geological column. As far as the order of the fossils is concerned, the prediction of the hydraulic cataclysm model, if you wish to call it that, flood geology as some have called it, would be this. If, for example, a worldwide flood were to strike the world today and then stir up things and carry them and deposit them, you would expect to find the formations, the deposits in somewhat similar fashion to what is actually found. That is, in any one locality, you'd expect to find the simpler organisms, so to speak, on the lower levels, the more complex organisms at the upper levels, because that's the order of elevation of their habitat. Now, you do not find the geological column as a whole anywhere. The geological column in its standard form represents something like 100 miles to 200 miles in thickness, depending on the writer that you happen to read. In any one locality, you'll find an average of 1 mile thickness of the sedimentary column. Some places nothing, some places maybe 15 miles or more, but the average about a mile. Nothing like the standard geological column anywhere. You find the standard geological column with the sequences in the so-called geological ages in one place only. That's in the textbook. You don't find it anywhere else in the real world. These different ages have to be brought together by superposition and various means, but the fact is the evidence of the phenomena, the physical phenomena of the rocks themselves indicate unit deposition, that is, unit at essentially one time, catastrophic formation of the entire system. Now, this would further predict, of course, that is, the catastrophic model would predict that there would be no way really of distinguishing between one age and another age, and we would not be surprised if we found, for example, the normal sequence from the simple on the bottom to the complex on the top, which is an order of ecological zonation, essentially, occasionally changed. And we do find occasional exceptions to it. For example, there are many places where formations which supposedly are very old, in terms of the geological column, are found vertically above those that are younger. Now, there are many places like that. We don't have the time to go into detail. The great Glacier National Park area is full of this. There's a great block out there that's been known as the Lewis Overthrust, which is about 6 miles thick in its original extent. As I recall the dimensions, I haven't looked this up recently, 40 miles wide and perhaps 200 miles long, or those may not be the exact dimensions, but at any rate tremendous in extent. And it's easily possible to show that there is no way, mechanically, speaking in terms of the strength of materials and the fluid pressure required to float such a block, if that's the way it was done, is sufficient to account for that. To have a great block of Precambrian materials, say 1 billion years old, which once was down below the Cretaceous materials, say 100 million years old, just completely inverted. There are certain places at the interface where there's evidence of disturbance, other places at the interface where there's no evidence of disturbance. But of course you can have disturbances at interfaces without any such thing as an overthrust or an out-of-order formation. And the mechanics of the situation seem to suggest it's impossible. You have many other examples of that. For example, the great Appalachian Range, this country, has been found within the past 2 or 3 years to be underlain by recent sediments. Now, the Appalachian rocks are supposedly Paleozoic, that is, very old. But underneath them, the coastal plains rocks, which are very young, comprise a horizontal layer extending fully under the Appalachians. And there are many other examples. The Alps are in the upside condition like that. The Scottish mountains, many of the other great mountain ranges of the world are like that. Well, there may be the possibility that there are physical mechanisms that explain how they once were in the right order and now are out of order. But the fact is there are many such places that are out of order, and there are many of them where there's no evidence at the interface that there has been any great differential movement. In some cases, yes. Many cases, no. Furthermore, there are many places where there are fossils from different ages together. Now, you wouldn't expect normally to find, for example, human fossils with dinosaur fossils. As was maybe suggested a while ago, we ought to find human fossils throughout the entire geological column. No, because man doesn't live with fishes, man doesn't live with dinosaurs. If there was a great worldwide cataclysm that buried them all, normally the burial would consist primarily of ecological assemblages that live together. They tend to be buried together, and normally man doesn't live with the dinosaurs, or wouldn't. Doesn't live with crocodiles. You wouldn't expect to find man buried with crocodiles today, or with maybe some exceptions, of course, because in a catastrophic situation there might be occasional exceptions where they, instead of being sorted hydrodynamically, which would be the normal situation, would be chaotically brought together from different directions and in some way brought together. And there are certain examples of anomalous fossils like that. One of the best known examples, of course, is the famous situation in Texas where you find human footprints and dinosaur footprints together in the Cretaceous limestones there. And I may have a slide just to show you that this does exist. Now, I know that these have been rejected by many evolutionists further on than that. Yeah, there's some footprints that were cut out of the limestones in the river of apparently a giant man track and dinosaurs. Now, of course, it was found later that some tracks had been carved. Many of the dinosaur tracks had been carved. A few of the human tracks had been carved. Possible these were, because when these were photographed, they'd already been cut out of the riverbed. However, they were subjected to cross-sectioning, to close microscopic examination to see if you could find evidence of the actual depressions of the silt laminae and so forth, and these were found. There's good reason to think that these were genuine. But in case these are questioned, the next slide will show some that could not be questioned. These are crossing trails of human and dinosaur tracks that were freshly exposed by the bulldozer pushing out an overlying layer. Now, there are these trails there. They're dinosaur tracks. Nobody questions those. It's a dinosaur state park in Texas. There are also several human trails. Right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot. They look like human tracks. If they're not human tracks, at least they look like it. They're not carvings. They're freshly excavated. They're not solution phenomena. They're clearly, as one geologist told me when I asked him what he thought about them, he said, well, they look like tracks of a two-legged animal of some kind, but he says they couldn't be man because man didn't live with the dinosaur. I asked him what he thought they were. He said, well, he didn't know. His best guess was that there was some kind of a dinosaur with feet like human feet. But at any rate, they look like human feet. There are several in the row. There are several trails of them. Some 20 or more human-like tracks have been found in the same strata, sometimes overlapping each other with the dinosaur tracks. Now, this is an exception, but there are other exceptions like this that indicate there is evidence that the different forms of life did live together, and therefore not so out of reason to think that they could have been buried together. Now, the question, however, of the so-called absolute age, the radiometric dates, the age of the universe, the age of the earth has been raised. Now, it's true, of course, that stars are estimated to be billions of light years away. And it's true that the suggestion was made, and not only by me, but many other creationists, that the whole creation was created fully functioning right to begin with. From the point of view of the creation model, that's not something to sort of sneer at. It's very realistic because in the creation period, the processes were not the same processes that we have now. That's the very essence of the model. Creation postulates different sorts of processes during the creation period. But if you don't like that, there are other explanations than direct creation of the light energy. It would be just as easy for the Creator to create light energy as light generators to generate light energy. If you believe in a creator at all, it's possible for him to do that. There's no deception involved, because to have real creation, where the creator speaks something into existence that wasn't there before, whatever it was, whether it was light energy or hydrogen gas or primeval stuff, whatever it was, if something is really created, then it was not there before, but now here it is, and it looked like it's been there before. So it necessarily has an appearance of some sort of an age. There's no way to have real creation without that, so there's no deception. That's the only way you can have creation. And then if there's other evidence as to the age, well, then that ought to take care of that particular problem. Matter of fact, we can't even be sure that these stars are billions of light years away. They're very sophisticated, esoteric sort of assumptions involved in calculating the distances. I don't find any fault with the distances, but you have to realize that it's not possible to actually measure the distance of a star that's more than, at the very most, 300 light years away by triangulation methods of measurement. The others have to be assumed by various indirect calculations, but I don't have any particular quarrel with that. I would suggest to you that you can explore the full concept of the various creationist possible explanations for the apparent great age of the stars. If you want to read a book by my colleague and astronomer, Dr. Harold Slusser, called Age of the Cosmos, he's discussed that in some depth. Same way with the evidence from radiometric dating. Dr. Slusser also has a little monograph that we published called Critique of Radiometric Dating. He's chairman of our astrogeophysics department at the Institute for Creation Research, also at the University of Texas in El Paso in the physics department there. Now, there are a number of assumptions involved in any kind of a geochronometer. All the real history we have goes back a few thousand years. The earliest dynasties of Egypt and so on, a few thousand years. Beyond that, have to use some kind of a physical process, make certain assumptions about it. With those assumptions, you can come out with an apparent age, but the true age can never be known without an observer there to check the assumptions. And of course, that's not possible. And the question is a very real question. How do you know which process to use? There are literally scores, hundreds of processes that could be used, because all processes involve changes with time, and therefore, at least in principle, could be used to measure time, if we just knew enough about them or could make enough assumptions about them. So why use only the 3 or 4 that give old ages, that have long half-lives, instead of the many processes that have more rapid rates and therefore will give younger ages, because they're based on the same assumptions. Next slide will just show kind of a general, oh, I'm sorry, that's another slide of the dinosaur. That's a dinosaur pictograph in the Havasupai Canyon. Next slide, please. Circular reasoning and geologic dating. We don't have time to talk about that. Next one, please. This is any kind of a system. You can consider that rubidium, strontium, if you wish, or uranium, lead, or whatever, or a physical system. Any kind of a system in which there are two components, very simple, only two, one parent, one daughter. Now, those are changing with time. Next slide shows much of the A component at time 0, much of the B component at time t, and the equations that can be, this is oversimplified, but you get the idea. Now, in order to do this, you can set up the equations for the mass change in each of the two components, A and B, have two simultaneous equations, solve for the time, and that's the equation at the bottom. Next slide shows the same equation at the top, but now in order to solve that equation, look at all the assumptions you have to make. And this is oversimplified. You have to assume that there's been a constant rate, for example. Now, there's no such thing in nature as a rate that cannot be changed, but that's not as important as the next assumption, which is a closed system. In other words, none of the uranium could be leached out, none of the lead brought in, none of the rubidium or the strontium could be assimilated. Strontium-87, for example, occurs abundantly in the Earth's crust, 10 times more than could possibly be derived by radioactive decay of rubidium. So you have to assume that there's been a closed system and none from outside has been assimilated in. And the final assumption, or the third assumption rather, the most important of all, is that the initial conditions are known. How much of the so-called daughter product was there when the system was first formed. Now, there's no such thing in nature as an unchangeable rate or as a closed system. That's an ideal concept. Doesn't exist in the real world. Or no way we can know these initial boundary conditions because nobody was there, say, 1 billion years ago. Therefore, we cannot be sure. Now, it may be that if you have several different calculations from different systems, different rates, give you different ages, if they all agree and are accordant ratios, then you can have a certain amount of confidence in them, but you can never be, of course, sure. Most of them, of course, are discordant. Now, it was mentioned that the rubidium-strontium method is probably the best. because there you can develop what's called an isochron diagram from different samples in different locations in the region, plot them up, and if they all fall on a straight line, that will indicate that the assumptions are valid and there's no possibility of it having been an open system or something. But now that's not necessarily so. Let me just read a couple of statements from two authors. One, this is in Science, 1976. One serious consequence of the mantle isochron model is that crystallization ages determined on basic igneous rocks by the Rubidium Strontium whole rock technique can be greater than the true age by many hundreds of millions of years. This is the problem of inherited age and is well documented in many instances of conflicts between the stratigraphic age and the Rubidium Strontium age in the literature. And in another article in the Geological Society of America Bulletin, May 1978, these data suggest that great caution must be used when applying the Rubidium Strontium whole rock technique to metamorphic rocks. This and other studies show that metasedimentary rocks can yield linear arrays of points on isochron diagrams, but that the age can have a variety of geological meanings and need not define the date of deposition or the date of metamorphism of the sediment, and so on. Now, we don't have time really to discuss that in depth, but the idea is that if the rubidium and the strontium are together in the mantle and they flow together, they'll stay together, and this is true of the uranium lead and potassium argon too. For example, one of our Creation Research Society scientists several years ago compiled all the data on uranium lead measurements on rocks of known age, that is, rocks that had been formed in the historic period of volcanic eruptions. And these were known to have been formed within the past, say, 200 to maybe 1,000 years. And there were over 20 of them, most of them in Russian language journals, some of them in English language journals, but all of them had calculated the uranium lead age on these basaltic rocks or lava rocks of recent date. And all of them were found to be up in the hundreds of millions of years or billions of years of apparent age. Now, the reason for the apparent discrepancy, of course, was that the uranium and the lead were together in the mantle. And these rocks flowed up through the Earth's crust and became an igneous rock. The uranium and the lead were together right from the start, so that the apparent age might have been 1 billion years when it was brand new. But the important point is, you see, whatever the reason why the uranium and the lead got together in the mantle, that's another subject altogether. That has to do with nucleogenesis and the origin of the elements, creation of the Earth. It has nothing to do with the age. But up here, where supposedly this is going to give you an age, you do have in every case the apparent age tremendously greater than the true age. And now you recognize that all uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon dates are made on igneous rocks, or metamorphic rocks, and these are formed the same way by the flow of a magma from the mantle, so probably all have the same problem. At any rate, we cannot be sure that they don't. So, up, and well, maybe later. Thank you.
There were a few people came up to me during the break and said I should be a little nice. Dr. Morris at all. In fact, I believe very strongly that Dr. Morris does an enormous service to science, and I really mean that, because he is the sort of person that always has to be around for science. He is the maverick. He is someone who is questioning established ideas, and it is always good to question established ideas. I think we refresh ourselves in our assumptions by trying to go back and see if what we look at has any base, and therefore I'm very happy to have him around, and I'm honored to be on the same stage with the foremost creationist scientists in the United States, and I'm having a wonderful time. Now, what I wanted to talk about was the statements he made about the age of the universe, that there are certain assumptions made in distances. Could you turn the slide projector back on and give me the second slide in the first carousel? It's a tough one now. Oh, sorry, third slide, first carousel. So you may not know, but I'm going to keep going till 3 in the morning. I have 4 carousels with me. There it is. Okay, there's that light years galaxy. That's 12 billion light years away. Now, Dr. Morris mentioned, he's absolutely right, that we do not measure the distance to that galaxy directly. That's true. I agree with it. There are only certain distances that we can measure by parallax. And parallax is the fact that when we look at a star, we go back and forth on a baseline, and we can measure slight changes in distance. We go to one side of the orbit in the Earth, and we take a picture of a star. We wait 6 months, and we go to the other side of the orbit, and we take another picture. And we can measure how much that star has moved in its position, in the same way that if I wanted to estimate the position to someone in the third row, I could take a look at him, I could walk over 10 feet and take another look over there, and by the angular change, I could estimate how far away he was. Now, that only works out to relatively short distances, perhaps 300 or 400 light years. Within that distance, there turns out to be a large number of stars. And we uncover in that distance a relatively simple relationship, and that is that the average brightness of the stars is related to their distance. And therefore, we begin to imply distance beyond that as the stars get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Now, for example, this galaxy, which is said to be 12 billion light years away, is implied in being at that distance by, first of all, identifying that it is indeed a galaxy, and not a single source of radiation, but many. In other words, it contains perhaps hundreds of millions of stars. The way that we infer the distance, once it's identified as a galaxy, and that identification is easy to make, is that it is very, very faint. Now, Dr. Morris said this was an assumption, that if it's faint, it must be far away. That's an assumption. I agree. All astronomers will agree. But if you don't accept the assumption, you have certain consequences. For example, it is possible, and no astronomer will argue with this, that galaxy may not be 12 billion light years away. That's possible. In fact, it could be 10,000 light years away. And the reason it seems that way is because the galaxy is very, very small and very, very dim, despite its close proximity. That's perfectly possible. It's true with all the other galaxies. However, it's a little bit like standing out on a street and watching the telephone poles in the distance and say, you see how they get real small when you get far away? I says, yeah. Well, that doesn't mean they're far away. It just means that down there are little bitty telephone poles. So if you go down there, you can pick one of those guys up and put it in your pocket and bring it back. Now, the neat thing about this galaxy, because it is the most distant galaxy ever discovered, that if the space shuttle ever gets off the ground, all we'll need to bring it back in is the cargo bay of the shuttle, because it ought to be so small that we can bring it home and hang it up in the middle of the auditorium and watch the little bitty stars go around. That's the kind of assumption that's involved, and I intend no disrespect to Dr. Morris at all, but I simply want to say what the assumption is, and if the assumption isn't valid, then we can do everything that I just said. Now, he said, for example, the radiometric dating, that we're not sure which process to use and so forth. They have many assumptions, and you don't know what the proportion of the daughter elements was when you started and so forth. Well, in the Rubidium Strontium method, you don't assume any of that. You measure it. You can measure the proportion of the daughter elements. You can determine if the system has been closed and so forth and so on. Now, what he's talked about is a phenomenon which is very well understood by geologists called inherited age. If a mineral exists near a volcano, when the volcano goes off, when Mount St. Helens explodes, the rocks on the mountains, probably many of which were formed a long time ago, can often get blown out with the exploding volcano and get laid down with the strata. Now, all the strata, all that ash around Mount St. Helens was formed exactly 1 year ago. But the rocks, which have been lying on the surface of Mount St. Helens at least since its last eruption, 100 years ago, and possibly longer than that, those rocks were clearly formed before last year. And in many cases, they will get laid down in ramification without being disturbed. That means if somebody comes around 1 billion years from now and picks out that, it is unfortunate enough to pick out that particular rock, he might tend to say that this particular rock in the Mount St. Helens deposition was in fact laid down much longer ago than it actually was. And that is an error that you can make. It's true, it's real. There are lots of papers about it. That's why he can quote them, and geologists worry about it all the time. However, does it say a single thing about the absolute age of the Earth being in error? The answer to that is no. It means that when you're near volcanic areas, and that's the only place these things occur, when you're near volcanic areas, or when you're near areas where whole rocks are being washed out by very violent floods and then resedimented without the rocks ever being disturbed, ever being broken up, geologists can recognize that kind of formation. You have to worry about picking up those whole rocks because they might give you ages not where they are now, but where they used to be. Does this have any influence on the age of the Earth? No. Okay. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting about Dr. Morris is that he mentioned that there were other processes that we could date the Earth by. I think the Institute for Creation Research has a pamphlet, and they got 78 or 85, a whole bunch of processes. You can make these measurements the way he showed on his colored slide, and you can tell how old something is by the processes, and for some horrible bias, those nasty evolutionists, they only like the processes that give us old ages. And there are lots of processes that give us young ages, and they don't accept them because they're prejudiced against them. Well, this is the debate, and we're going to bring the scientific facts out tonight. And what I would challenge Dr. Morris to do in his remaining 5 minutes is to tell us what those processes are that yield a young age for the Earth. If there's real scientific evidence, if there's another process which is equally as valid as the radiometric dating, please tell us what it is. We'll get a chance to discuss it out in the open. And failing that, I simply have to say, if you say there's a process and you won't tell us what it is, there must be something the matter with it, and I'll leave that simply at that point. Okay. Let's see. This is what happens when you're ready to go to 3 in the morning and bring too damn many slides. Could you show us on the first carousel, this is embarrassing, let's see, slide 48. Got that? I hope you understand the reason I have all these slides is because I have heard tapes of Dr. Morris debate, and he is really good, and I simply wanted to make sure that I had things to fall back on. Now, one of the things that Dr. Morris may point out is that there's quote after quote, and he read a lot of them at the beginning when he opened, of scientists saying that, gee, we ought to re-examine evolutionary theory. Evolution doesn't fit the facts. Evolution is untestable, and so forth and so on. Well, all the quotes are real. He didn't make any of them up. He's an honorable man. He doesn't fake quotes. But I want to show you what the quotes come from and what they mean. Now, up here, I've tried to show you the semantic trick that is being played in using many of these quotes. Now, we use the word evolution in a couple of ways. On the left-hand side is what I call the evidence of evolution. The fact that the Earth is old, and the fact, and it is a fact, that when we dig down in the ground, we find a succession of forms. We find a record of change through time. 50 million years ago, what was alive on this planet, and we know a lot about it. The museums of the world are packed with fossils all over the place. There's so many fossils that the guys can tell you where they are, and they can let you go ahead and dig, and you still can't get them all out. The museums of the world are packed with evidence of change. 50 million years ago, life was different from what it is today. 50 million before that, it was different again, and so forth and so on. There was a record of change through time, and the record shows overwhelmingly and with great eloquence that the past changed, or evolved, if you prefer, changed into the present. Okay, given those facts, how do we explain the process? The process is real. How do we explain it? Well, there are two general ways which biologists have tried to explain it by. One of them was started by Charles Darwin, and today we call it Darwinian Theory, Neo-Darwinian Theory, gradualistic evolution, or the combination of mutation and natural selection. This is the classic model. It predicts slow and gradual change and so forth and so on. There's another model you may have heard about. It's championed by Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard and Niles Eldredge of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. They coined a mouthful of a term called punctuated equilibrium. I don't think it's ever going to be as catchy as Darwin's theory. Punctuated equilibrium suggests that evolution is saltatory. It jumps, and we see rapid changes followed by speciation and another rapid change and so forth and so on. Now, there is very great controversy here. The fact of the matter is that Dr. Morris has produced a large number of quotes from the punctuated equilibrium people saying that neo-Darwinian theory is not adequate, Darwin's theory is not adequate, so forth and so on. My own, and I'm not an evolutionary biologist, I'm a cell biologist. I do biochemistry and molecular biology. I don't work in evolution as a professional. My own feeling and my own reading of the field is that I'm on the side of the punctuated people because I think their theory is closer to the facts, and I think we're on the verge of uncovering the genetic mechanisms of how it works. However, we don't know the mechanisms, and we don't have a satisfactory theory. Now, Dr. Morris may think that this is very important when he says that no theory of evolution formulated at the present time can explain all the facts. That's true. I'll say it if he doesn't say it first. If a theory existed which explained everything in the scientific sense, there'd be nothing for evolutionary biologists to do. I mean, they could sell insurance, they could be deans, no offense, Dr. Rohr, or something like that, but they wouldn't have to be evolutionary biologists. If you look closely at the nature of other sciences, you will discover that we have no atomic theory which explains all the facts. No gravitational theory which explains all the facts. No theory which accounts, for example, for the unitary nature of the charge on the electron. Now, is this a disaster? Does this mean all these sciences are in disrepute the way Dr. Morris would like to have us believe evolution is? Of course not. This mystery is precisely what draws men and women to science. Einstein said, in an oft-quoted passage, that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. And that's perfect. No one can say that better. Now, Dr. Morris can produce quote after quote showing that no evolutionary theory is adequate. And if he runs out of them, I'll give him 5 more. But can he produce a single quote that says that the evidence is upside down, that the fossil record doesn't matter? Can he produce a single quote which says we see no record of change in the past? Can he produce a single quote which says, in short, that evolution has not occurred? Of course not. The reason he can't do it is because that is what the evidence says, that evolution has occurred. Okay. Can I have slide 58? This is daring. I want you to understand that. I wouldn't normally do this. Same carousel. Okay. It's daring because I'm going to talk about human evolution. There's a rule when you debate a creationist. Don't bring human evolution up, because people might not mind how a fern got here, they might not mind how a trilobite got here, but they're certainly going to mind how they got there. And therefore, human evolution is touchy. When you get right down to it, there's only one reason that people get emotional about evolution. And that's because we put ourselves into that biological world, and we say that our species was produced also by the evolutionary process. Now, I will not deal with all the specimens that have been unearthed, because there are simply too many. I've tried to establish that there is an extraordinary close relationship between our species and, for example, the chimpanzee and also the gorilla and also the orangutan. Now, the relationship is so close that if you were to uncover 2 species, let's say of Drosophila, which had, as we do with the chimpanzees, 99% of the sequence homology in non-repetitive DNA. And that's a big mouthful, which means the important genes in the genetic material match 99% of the time between us and the chimpanzee. If you uncovered 2 species of fruit fly in which the homology was that close, you would suggest the possibility of a fertile offspring between those 2 species of fly. Now, I'm not going to suggest the possibility of a fertile offspring between us and chimpanzees, and I'm certainly not going to suggest that we do the experiment. But the fact of the matter is that the relationship is extremely close. Okay, what do we find out about the development of our own species? I mean, did we develop from monkeys and so forth and so on? One of the things that is not understood, not appreciated, I think, by most people, is that we know that we are recent appearances on this planet. Well, surprised, so's the gorilla, so's the chimpanzee, so's the orangutan. They, if anything, are the offshoots of an evolutionary tree, and they, in effect, are offshoots of the same tree that produced us. Now, the fact of the matter is we didn't come from them. Absolutely, we didn't evolve from the apes we see today. No way. We don't find them in the fossil record. We evolved rather from a common ancestor, the sort of splitting that we see consistently in an evolutionary tree. Okay. Now, for example, let's go back, because there are enormous gaps before this, and Dr. Morris will point them out, and I'll say, yes, they're there, to about 3 million years ago. At 3 million years ago, there's a series of creatures with different species names, but all of whom are given the genus name Australopithecus. There's one. There's a skull, an Australopithecus skull. Now, there was enormous controversy as to whether or not Australopithecus was man-like. And I'm sure that Dr. Morris, when he gets up, he's going to have a lot of quotes both ways. But here's where it gets interesting. You see, Australopithecus has a lot of human-like characteristics. The teeth look a lot like ours and other things. It looks sort of, intermediate between a man and a monkey. You wouldn't know how to classify it. The sort of problem you get if you have good transitional forms. Now, until very recently, it was debated, and hotly debated, whether or not Australopithecus walked upright. The reason for that is all we had were skulls. It's really hard to tell from a skull whether something walked upright. There's a slight difference in the foramen magnum, which is the big whole base of the skull. And if you walk like this, then it's tilted back a little bit so you can hold your head up straight. If you walk up straight, the foramen magnum is in a slightly different position. In very few of these skulls is it well developed, and he may have quotes from the Leakeys and from other people saying Australopithecus walked on its knuckles like a monkey and so forth and so on. Just listen carefully to the dates of the quotes. Next slide. we now have much more recent skeletal remains of Australopithecus. This is a nearly complete skeleton. It's given the nickname Lucy. That's what this particular one is, from a young female. It dates about 3 million years old. And in Lucy, we have part of the pelvis, as you can see. Now, she was part of a find that was made, which include a large number of other individuals, including, as shown in the next slide, a nearly complete pelvis. And that is shown for comparison to a human pelvis. There is, since these finds, no doubt in any anatomist who can take a look at that hip that Lucy walked upright. And that is the clearest way to see it, is by looking at the entire hip bone. She walked upright, and so did all her friends, which we found in this simple Australopithecus find. Okay. Now, later than Australopithecus, we find, as we move from 3 million years to the present, creatures who are more and more like ourselves. For example, there's something called Homo erectus, who lived about 1 million years ago. We give us the same genus name as ourselves, but a different species name. We have many skulls of the Homo erectus type. We also have a more primitive type called Homo habilis. And these, of course, lead to another species, which you've all heard about, now called Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, and to our own species, which we, in an arrogant burst of pride, call Homo sapiens sapiens, which means man, wise. And that is a misnomer if I've ever heard one. Okay. Now, Dr. Morris will look at the array of these creatures, and he'll say, well, all we have in here are either apes with big brains or people who had malnourished, they had rickets and they have little brains and so forth and so on. And indeed, it is true that there is enormous confusion among students of human evolution to say how we should order these specimens and how we should draw the family tree. Next slide. No two anthropologists do it the same way. Here are two proposed evolutionary trees coming from Australopithecus and leading to our own species. They branch in different places. They're not sure where they came from and so forth and so on. Dr. Morris has probably got a quote from one guy saying, this one can't be our ancestor. He's probably got a quote from another guy saying, the other one can't be our ancestor too. So we don't have any ancestors. The reason for that, essentially, is not because, I repeat, it is not because we lack transitional forms between ourselves and these creatures. It is rather because we have an embarrassing abundance of transitional forms, so many we don't know how to connect them. The next slide is a graphic representation of sort of how to show this. Dr. Morris will say, and a special creationist would believe, that there should be a clear gap in the fossil record between fossil men and fossil apes and nothing in between. This is a series showing the size in cubic centimeters of the inner casts of hominid brains, leading from Australopithecus near the top to Homo erectus at the bottom. And what they show in terms of brain capacity is a continuous series of intermediates. Please look at this. Show me the gap. Show me the clear dividing line between one and another. What Dr. Morris or any other special creationist will be left to do is to get up and look at this beautifully clean transition and say, that's a monkey, that's a monkey, that's a monkey, whoop, that's a man, that's a man, that's a man, so forth and so on. You just can't do it. The evidence doesn't lead you to do it that way. It simply doesn't work. This slide does not purport to show that the one on top was the great-great-great-great-grandfather, and the next one was an offspring, and the next one, and so forth. This slide is not arranged in supposed order of descent or anything else. It is simply designed to illustrate the fact that we have all sorts of things between ourselves and things that are recognizable in terms of being another species, namely something that is not around today, but if it was around, we might call it an ape or something like that. This is not what one would predict if man were separate and specially created. It rather is what one would predict if what we see in the universe, in the world, is, as I believe, not as a scientist, but in a religious sense, part of an enormous unitary creation in which the Creator has not made us separate, but has welded us in to the fabric of life which encompasses all the organisms on this planet. Thanks.
Gentlemen will now proceed to ask the speakers to give their concluding statements. Again, by common agreement, new information or arguments are not to be introduced. These are to be summary statements. In fairness to Dr. Morris, who lost a minute or two in his opening statement owing to the failure of the microphones, and in fairness generally, if he wants to overrun the 5-minute time allowed for the concluding statement, that will be perfectly correct.
That's a dangerous offer to make, but I'll try to not abuse it too much. Since Dr. Miller did challenge me to produce some of the evidence for a young Earth, I guess that's not introducing new material, so may I have them, I think, about 2 slides beyond what we were. This is the table that he mentioned. It's in one of our publications. Obviously, there's not going to be time enough to discuss any of them. No, beyond that. Way beyond that. There, that one. These are some of the processes which, with the same assumptions as in normal radiometric dating, that is, of a constant rate, a closed system, and assumed initial boundary conditions, you can get all sorts of different ages. The first one, the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, is probably pretty good because the assumption of a closed system, with the core of the Earth being involved, where the magnetic field is generated, is probably pretty good. The assumption of a constant rate, pretty good. Half-life about 1,400 years because there's nothing much going to change it at that point. Now, this was worked out in detail by Dr. Tom Barnes, whom I mentioned earlier, who learned his physics here at Brown University. But for many years, he's been a leading researcher in the field of atmospheric physics and magnetism, has a couple of widely used textbooks in this field. He knows what he's talking about, and he's presented this material before many scientific bodies and teachers and so on, and there's no real answer to it except to just say that the assumptions are wrong. And they may be, but with the reasonable assumptions, even more reasonable than in the case of radiometric dating, you'll get that the age of the Earth from that is on the order of 10,000 years. And so with the others, we don't have time to discuss them. The next slide shows some more. Next slide. And the next slide. And the next 2 more. Each one of these we could discuss and show that the assumptions are reasonable, that all the possible sources of error that have been at all capable of being allowed for have been provided. The dates that they give, we would suggest, are at least as reasonable as those given by uranium or rubidium or potassium dating. But in the last analysis, you can't know for sure, of course. We would just suggest this, that since the assumptions of uniformitarianism are more likely to be valid for a short time than for a long time, those processes that give young ages are more likely to be correct than those that give old ages, other things being equal, and besides, there are many more of them. So the weight of the scientific evidence is that the Earth is young. That's the testimony of the geological evidence, too, formed by one catastrophe, primarily hydraulic in nature, as we've already pointed out. Another point that was made by Dr. Miller was that man and the chimpanzee are closely related because of the biochemistry, the hemoglobin, and so on. And that does seem to be the case as far as the alignment of the tabular values. My colleague, Dr. Parker, who is chairman of our biology department, once an evolutionist, used to teach evolution in college, has become a creationist, and I can't vouch for this, but let me just quote what he says on this. He says, if you look at blood serum studies, that is the right anus serum, sure enough, man's closest relative is a chimpanzee. But on the basis of milk chemistry, man's nearest relative is the jackass. On the basis of cholesterol level, his nearest relative is the garter snake. On foot structure, it's the glacial bear. On the tear enzyme, it's a chicken. On the basis of blood antigen A, our nearest relative is the butterbean. So it depends on which chemical you use as to what the family tree turns out to be. Now, with respect to human evolution, I'm sorry there's not really time. Dr. Miller has already said several times what I would say in response to what he said. So to an extent he's right, and I don't have time to do it, but with respect particularly to the Australopithecines, now these were at the bottom of both of the family trees he represented. They're the ones that he spoke of that relate to Lucy, to Homo habilis, and so forth. Now, there is a difference of opinion as to whether they walked upright or not, and the people that have made the greatest amount of study of the Australopithecine fossils, and I'm speaking of Lord Zuckerman in England and his team, including Dr. Charles Oxnard, who now in this country is Dean of the Graduate School and a professor of anatomy at the University of Southern California. These men are primarily those who have analyzed this material in detail, measured it in the laboratory, not people who dig it up in the field like Dr. Leakey and Dr. Johansson and others, but have devoted a great deal of time to detailed multivariate statistical analysis. And they have taken all the Australopithecine dentition, the skull structure that has been found, the limb bones, the knee bones, and so forth, and they have come to the conclusion that although if you orient the structure in a certain direction, it looks like it might be an erect posture. If you turn it around 90 degrees, it looks like an ape, the four-legged posture. As Dr. Leakey once said, Australopithecus was a long-armed, short-legged knuckle walker. I think he's somewhat changed his views since then, but the evidence is still very equivocal. Dr. Charles Oxnard, who certainly knows this subject far better than I do, surely, and he knows it as well as anyone, I think. He says, as far as the Australopithecine fossils are concerned, these new investigations suggest that the fossil fragments are usually uniquely different from any living form. When they do have similarities with living species, they're often as not reminiscent of the orangutan. And he's convinced that they're a blind alley. Whatever they were, they're some kind of an extinct ape, more closely allied with the orangutan than anything else. And Dr. Zuckerman, who surely knows this subject if anyone does, in his book Beyond the Ivory Tower, says this: in the interpretation of man's fossil history, whether the faithful anything is possible, the ardent believer is sometimes able to believe several contradictory things at the same time. He says if man evolved from some ape-like creature he did so without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. Now, there obviously are different voices on this subject among anthropologists and others, and at any rate, the evidence is still very equivocal with respect to human evolution and the intermediate forms there, and this is the so-called most recent arrival on the evolutionary time scale. And if we don't have any clear evidence of man's origin, then no wonder we find such a complete universality of gaps in the other layers of the fossil record. As far as the evidence goes, each basic kind of creature was created that kind of creature. There's variations within the kind. Whatever the kind was, it could perhaps be as much as the family, say the horse family, the dog family, and so on, or the dog genus. Could be genus, could be family, probably broader than the species. But at any rate, beyond a certain limit, there is, for example, Dr. Simpson says each of the 32 orders of mammals appears suddenly in the fossil record without any known antecedents, and so on. Now, this is exactly what you'd expect in terms of creation. Now, we have not proved, and I said that from the beginning, that we cannot prove creation scientifically, we cannot disprove evolution, and you can put it just exactly opposite. These are models, they're paradigms, they're systems, they're beliefs. What we can do, however, is continually look at the evidence in terms of the two models. That's what we've tried to do tonight. And you may have your convictions one way or the other, and that's fine. At least we suggest that the current method of teaching only the one model needs to be changed. We need to have not only this kind of a meeting, say, once every decade in a big auditorium, but every day in the classroom as an exercise, continually having the students look at both models as they relate to all kinds of evidence, recognizing that there are two worldviews and both deserve consideration. Thank you very much.
The Lord hath delivered him into my hands. Slide 69, please. '69. Aristotle thought. Getting myself in trouble. Now, Dr. Mars has committed an enormous logical contradiction with his 79 methods. The first thing he said in his book is, we can only know the age of the earth by divine revelation, meaning there can be no scientific evidence about the age of the earth. But then he says, by the way, I've got some, and it says it's young. Now, all that I propose we do is to look at that evidence as critically as we can. Slide 69, please. There you go. Okay. The Earth's magnetic field decays. I assume he took his best shot. I assume he named the best method for getting a young age for the Earth. The Earth's magnetic field has been measured for the last 140 years. That's true. During that time, it has shown a decay. The decay is exponential. The Earth's magnetic field decays right now with a half-life of 1,400 years. And therefore, that suggests that 1,400 years ago is twice as strong, 2,800 years ago 4 times as strong, and so forth and so on. That's true. That's a fact. Therefore, that's a proof that the Earth is 10,000 years old. And the reason for that, Dr. Morris might say, if he had sufficient time, I'll make the argument for him, give him a break, is that at 10,000 years ago, the field would have had to be so strong that we'd all be pointing towards the North Pole. It's absolutely true. It'd be unimaginably strong. So why is it that he chooses to make this argument in front of a general audience instead of a bunch of geologists to educate them? And the reason is because the geologists would laugh him out of the room. This is a slide showing the magnetic field that is captured in the mid-Atlantic ridge where the Earth's crust comes up from the core and spreads. Now, when certain kinds of minerals cool and crystallize, those minerals preserve in their molecular structure a little compass pointing towards the magnetic pole. That's established, that's a fact. And what one discovers when one looks at the Earth's floor is that in different ages, as the floor has spread, all of a sudden the North Pole and the South Pole have reversed. I think in this slide, the normally magnetized lava is shown in black, and the abnormally, the ones that are pointing to the South Pole, which is actually the North Pole and so forth and so on, are shown in white. In other words, the Earth's magnetic field has gotten stronger and weaker and stronger and weaker and stronger and weaker and reversed and gone back and reversed and gone back again and again through history. The next slide shows that if you drill down into the ocean core, that's exactly what you find. Now, the rates of sedimentation are in different oceans, but the pattern of reversals is consistent. The next slide shows the number of reversals that we have documented for the recent past. And as you can see, there are enormous numbers of magnetic field reversals. The reason we don't use this uncritical characteristic to measure the age of the Earth is because it's wrong. In fact, it turns out to be a proof. Now, it's not wrong. It's not wrong because it contradicts evolution. It's wrong because we can see that the Earth's magnetic field has reversed hundreds of times in the previous past. In fact, if you calculate the rate of reversal we see right now and realize that it's occurred this many times, it turns out to be a proof for the old age for the Earth. It's remarkable. Next slide. Now, there are other sorts of things that many of you may be familiar with, and Dr. Morris didn't have time to bring up. I'm cruising along okay, so I'll make an argument for him. There's an old article that creationists like to quote that says that cosmic dust accumulating on the Earth should have formed in 5 billion years an enormous layer of dust. It should be 60 feet thick, and it's not here. I heard this argument made on television by a preacher in an argument with Carl Sagan. It's a very, very interesting argument. The article they quote, and this is indicative of the creationist philosophy, and this is one of the methods in Dr. Morris's list. The article they quote is a Scientific American article from 1959 by Hans Pedersen. And Pedersen came out with a figure of 5 million tons of dust per year. He climbed up on some high mountains in Hawaii where there were no factories around spewing metal particles into the atmosphere and tried to measure the distinctive metals that come down in meteorites. This is the figure he got. The numbers about 20 or 60 or 80 feet thick are absolutely true. The creationist says, we didn't find that much dust on the moon. Therefore, the universe must be recent. Well, it's interesting to me that the creationists, when they do it, will quote this article, 20 years old. Now, the reason for that is because when we go into space and put satellites up, one of the first things NASA did was to try to measure the rate of meteorite dust accumulation. The next slide. And the reason Pedersen stopped doing the work was because he was a Swede and he couldn't put an experiment on the American satellites. And what we discovered in space is that the rate of dust accumulation is, in fact, much, much less. It turns out to be 10 to the minus 16th to 10 to the minus 17th gram per square centimeter per second. That's actually a lot of dust. And if you multiply that times the estimated age for the universe, you come up with an accumulation of dust in the range somewhere between 1.5 centimeters and 15 centimeters. That's about 6 inches. Okay, we went to the moon a few years ago. Next slide. What did we find on the moon? We found the right amount of dust. The surface of the moon is covered by a material known as the regolith. The regolith is a debris blanket of pulverized lunar surface. And what we discover on the surface of the moon is, in fact, that the right amount of dust is there. About 1% of the 10-meter thick regolith is meteorite dust. 1% of 10 meters is 10 centimeters, right in the middle of the range. When you examine any of the processes that Dr. Morris uncritically brings up and says, but I've got evidence for a young age, the magnetic field reversal, the meteorite dust, or anything else, they turn out to be arguments for an old age. Rest my case. Thank you.